Hi everyone, and welcome, and thanks for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here. During this webinar, you will hear from our student expert, Brian McDowell, and from the University of Findlay on their student transformation journey. My name is Stephanie, and I will be your moderator for the webinar today. But before we get started, I would like to run through a couple of the house rules real quick. Everyone is on mute and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. However, the chat function is available. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to chat those over to us and we'll make sure to answer them at the end of the webinar. If we do not get to your question, however, we will follow up as soon as possible. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. So it will be available for playback tomorrow. So with that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Brian McDowell. Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about preparing for a higher education transformation and some of the work that we've done at the University of Findlay. By way of introduction, my name is Dr. Brian McDowell. I'm a principal consultant with Collaborative Solutions. I've been with the company for just over a year. Prior to that, I worked in a AAU Research One institution for over a decade in a variety of roles, student services, enrollment management, career services, etc. So as it stands now, I primarily work in the student records area, but tend to dabble into other things as it comes up. And then, Anne, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
My name is Ann Wells, and I am the Director of Finance for the University of Findlay, which is probably a little bit weird considering we talk about Workday Student, but I did the implementation at the University of Findlay for Workday Finance, and now have moved over to be the project lead for Workday Student. So very excited. We are officially 50% way through our project. So
it's very exciting. My workstream meetings were all today and yesterday. Kicking off work set 3, so we're doing a lot of great work, which I enjoy a lot. So in this particular webinar today, we're going to talk a little bit about the Findlay project and the practice overview for Collaborative Solutions. We're going to jump over to academic calendars. That's our specific topic today. I'm going to give a high-level guide on what an academic calendar is in Workday, so we all have the same frame of reference. And then Ann and I will talk a little bit about the Findlay experience specifically around academic calendars, and then enter a question and answer session so we can all get out of this webinar everything that we want. So Ann, why don't you start by talking about the University of Findlay?
Yep, so the University of Findlay, we're a private institution. We have over 80 bachelor's degrees, 11 master's, 4 doctorate. We offer traditional online, and actually we offer a weekend program, which I'll be talking about a little bit. Right now we're about 3,800 students, 1,200 are graduate, and 1,200 living on campus. So we are a residential campus. We have about 625 full-time employees, 200 adjunct, and over 1,000 student workers throughout the year. In addition to that, we have a couple campuses. So we have our main campus. We have 2 farms that we operate, in English and Western writing farms. We also offer pre-veterinary science, and then we have an all hazards training center at a different location. Our current system, for those of you who are Genzabar CX, we're on Genzabar CX, and it was actually implemented in 1985. We went live with HCM and actually in July of 2018, and then finance in August 1. That's our fiscal year of 2018. So as I mentioned, we are going live with Workday Student in fall of 2021, and we're 50%, actually over 50% of the way through our project. And I think one of the important things to mention here is fall of 2021 is our first academic semester, but actually we'll be going live with our first milestone in October of 2020. So a few short months. That'll be ICERs and courses, and then advising for fall of 2021 will start in spring of 2021. So our staggered go lives, we have 4 of them throughout our project, with the first coming up in August. So right around the corner.
It is coming along way too quickly for my own taste, but we'll get there. It'd be great. So I look forward to actually getting registration up and running, which is part of that spring component. So collaborative solutions, want to give a little overview of our company and kind of our approach. We are one of the first 3 Workday partners that were in the ecosystem, and of those 3, we're the only ones that are presently still active and moving. And one of the things that we like to point out, or at least a couple takeaways from this slide, there's a lot of great information here, but we are also a Workday customer. We were the 3rd financial management customer and the 26th HCM customer. We're not an institution of higher ed, so we are not a client in Workday Student, but we of course have our alma mater university that we do demos and other work in. A couple other points to make from here. We have over 800 Workday customers, so and a 98% customer satisfaction. That is huge in the sense that we really have done this work, we have been in this space for a long time, and that we are really meeting our customers' needs and requirements. The other thing that we like to point out that's really not on this slide, and when you talk about selecting a partner in a Workday transition to student in particular, these are long, big projects. And we have a 2% attrition rate amongst our consulting population in the last year. What that means for you, when you think about the types of projects we're going after with Workday Student, the length of this project is usually 18 months to 2 years. You're not getting the kind of turnover amongst our consultant population that you might expect maybe at some other places. So we're well under the industry standard for attrition rate. So you can expect as you start your project that you get to work with a lot of the same individuals all the way from start to finish when you work with collaborative solutions. Now, specifically over to the student practice, some numbers that are kind of interesting. I have one that's near and dear to me on this, which is of course the number 1 that says EdD, leadership in higher ed, because that's me, and I'm excited about that. But more importantly on this is the years of higher education experience in relevant roles. 212 years of higher education experience amongst our Workday student practice and supporting individuals. We really understand higher education. Our consultants, especially in the student practice, are coming from institutions of higher ed of a variety of types, whether it's a community college, a 4-year institution like me on the public side, private institutions. We have walked in your shoes on a number of projects, on a number of initiatives at our own institutions before we joined Collaborative Solutions. And we bring that 212 years with us in supporting any student implementation and work that we do. And I think more than anything else, when we talk about, from my perspective, what we bring to the table, it's that full understanding of what it takes. Sometimes that understanding of even the pain points and really, like I said, living in the same shoes that you live in. So
I think I'll add to that, Brian. Kind of that is one of the main reasons that the University of Findlay chose collaborative solutions. We had that experience that Brian referred to. We had consultants in Workday and HCM that have never even operated in the Workday, in the HCM or finance space. They didn't come from industry. They just knew how to implement a product. That along with the retention problems. I think we cycled through 3 full teams on both HCM and finance when we did it. So I can vouch for the difference that we've felt at the University of Findlay and Collaborative and the experience they bring. I think it's just one thing to know about a product. It's a whole nother thing to know about higher ed and the policies and processes that kind of go on behind the scenes. That actually gear you up for the project. So that's one thing, why why we chose collaborative.
Great, thank you, Mel. Great point. So moving forward into a little bit more conversation about academic calendars specifically, we wanted to provide you an example of the type of work and the type of support that we do as part of the student implementation. And academic calendars are one of the most important components of the system, and probably one of the areas that I felt was a really great conversation and great experience that we had with the University of Findlay. So kind of level setting and providing some information about academic calendars and what they are in Workday. The academic calendar defines the types of academic periods that make up a year. what you think of as a fall, spring, or summer, for example. This is configurable, so it could have winters, it can have other components. There are the opportunity for standard terms and then non-standard terms that roll up into those as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in how we structure that concept inside of the academic calendar. And those periods then in this academic calendar structure then are a template that allow you to build academic years. And that template is kind of a stamp that we then roll forward from academic year to academic year. So that structure is in the calendar, the period types that we're using, and then we take that whole process, we stamp it down and create an academic year, like the 21-22 year example that is on screen. And that's coming with all the start dates and end dates and components that we need to appropriately run things like registration, but also do things like disperse aid, do billing and refund schedules. And honestly, this is touching effectively everything in the Workday student side of things, and actually a little bit even potentially, if desired, into HCM and Fin on previous implementations, if you want to use things like activity period pay, for example. Now, the system, as we talked about it, Workday Student has the flexibility to support multiple calendars. It does not need to be an environment where you have just one. Those calendars can be associated with different colleges or schools or specific majors if you desire to do so. But there is a lot of flexibility in creating a standard, like a fall, spring, summer, but creating other divergent editions as needed. As I mentioned before, the academic calendars have those standard and non-standard academic periods, and that creates the stamp that defines an academic year. And then finally, I mentioned it before, but I cannot express this strongly enough, is that academic calendars have huge cross-functional impacts to every other area of Workday Student. What we choose for a calendar builds the rails that we're going to use in every other area, and will honestly define usually the success of a lot of different configuration for the remainder of the project. So we want to spend a lot of time and energy, and the right type of time and energy, in making good decisions around this. Which is where I'm going to hand it off to Anne for a minute to talk a little bit about her experience with calendars at the University of Findlay.
Yeah, so, part of this presentation is obviously about student, readiness and getting ready for the student project. And I think one of the things that early on, and we actually did this even before we went to student, we had it go live with HCM and finance were our guiding principles. So there's 4 here that we have adapted here at the University of Findlay, because we knew that our environment needed to have a point of reference when it came to decision making. We felt like when we were faced with a choice, we needed to have something to lean on to help make those decisions. And really, it helped us explain the collaborative solutions, and therefore they were able to frame these conversations with these principles in mind. And I'm sure they're very familiar to any higher ed school. Again, I mentioned we were on Genzabar. One of our goals was to embrace the solution as is as much as possible. So, and to keep it simple. Brian will kind of go into it, but at the very least, we really wanted to start with one calendar, and then we wanted to prove to ourselves why we needed multiple calendars. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit, but keeping it simple was really where we wanted to start with everything. The next 2, communicate often in a systematic manner, and I'll touch on this a little bit about how we use that within this decision-making process for inroads into policy making and policy changes and that type of thing. And then obviously we all have our own, opinions about what's right and wrong, should or shouldn't happen. And part of that is just trying to respect each other's opinions and their experiences, because they have those opinions for a reason. So we felt these were our good principles that we could always lean on, collaborative could lean on, and they needed to remind us at times, hey, you all said keep it simple, and I'm telling you this is not simple, so it's a good partnership there to make sure that they have that information when preparing for these conversations. Let's see. All right. So I'm going to go a little bit into how we manage the academic calendars before workday, and then, what the academic programs needed, efficiencies, and then obviously our compliance and accreditation issues. So as I'm sure many of you, we had our standard fall, spring, summer. Well, let me step back a little bit and explain our makeup of our degree programs. We have a really strong College of Health Professions. And so as any of you who have College of Health Professions know, that comes along with clinical rotations, and typically not just one clinical rotation, multiple clinical rotations that like to span across academic periods. So that's one uniqueness. We also offer our standard semester, so fall, spring, summer. We offer 8-week online degree programs. So every 8 weeks starts a new class. So we call that a block program. And then we also offer a weekend-based program. So really what it is 4 quarters per year on semester credit hours. So if you can't get any more unique than that, I don't know what is. We're not allowed to say quarters, so it's 4 terms per year. And it's a physical therapy and occupational therapy programs. They're on that calendar. I should say they were on that calendar, and we've, been able to kind of transition them. So that's the makeup of where we started from. We have everything from very traditional to weekend. And in our current system, we really adhere to a fall, spring, summer. So everything we do rolls up into a fall, spring, summer calendar. And as an example of that, with our weekend program, we actually have a winter and a spring rolling up into a spring. And that's not quite, the most transparent for students to understand. So we were really early on in adopting kind of these unique programs. I mean, I think it went into the early 90s. And so in our current system, we actually had to adopt custom code to accommodate them. Custom code in billing, custom code in registration, custom code in financial aid. And at one point we even created a weekend calendar. So we had fall, spring, summer, then we had weekend, fall, spring, summer, winter. And unfortunately, as the product grew that we were on, it actually became a standard. Well, we had customized our product so much that we were unable to kind of back ourselves out of this custom code, which because we were, it had accommodated our needs. And how do you flip from custom to standard? And so that's one of the things that really became a challenge for us in our current system is we customized so highly so early on that we couldn't back ourselves out of where we were. That's probably where number 2, keep it simple, came in, because it was not simple where we're at. One of the, like Brian mentioned, one of the main things that we focused on because we were so customized is the downstream and long-term impacts of any decisions that we made. We really didn't want to make a decision that would leave us, a year from now with complications. And so adapting kind of the standard module, the standard academic calendar, and then leveraging the system capabilities and such as like non-standard academic periods and course spanning functionality, that kind of allowed us to get some uniqueness into our academic calendar to make it work a little bit better. So those conversations. Probably, and obviously efficiencies, we talk so many times, and I remember, we have one person on our project that would constantly say, but what does that mean, long term? What does that mean workload wise? What does that mean? Because we wanted to make sure that what we were doing wasn't creating a ton of additional work that we weren't used to. And then while this is bullet point number 4, it's actually bullet point number 1. We just put it as 4 to make people feel better. Financial aid compliance is huge for us. We actually have, I'm sure over 90% of our students are receiving federal financial aid. So while an academic calendar may provide flexibility, so you may get what you want, and you're like, yeah, I really like that. you have to also take into consideration the financial aid aspect of it. So Brian mentioned, understanding that the academic calendar is the driver for everything that goes on downstream. We at one point had, talked about a calendar that would put us into BBay 3. And we all said absolutely not and walked away from that as quickly as possible, leaning on collaborative to kind of help us find a solution to, what would get us out of BBay 3. So lots of different things. That's kind of where we came from. I would also mention that the programs were doing something a little bit different than what it actually said. So that's one of the things we also ask collaborative is, okay, if a course starts on a certain date, I want to see on the course catalog that it starts on that date, not having our programs do something on their own. And in their defense, they had to, because our current system didn't accommodate it. So we also needed to take into consideration when the academics had their clinicals, when they had to start, based on what hospitals and things like that, places like that want their students to be there. So we had many conversations with our academic programs, each one individual, some together, and also with our faculty senate. So we're constantly, everyone knew going in that this was a hot topic for us at the university. And then this is kind of a snapshot of where we started. So it's probably nicer than what the reality of where we were, but this is kind of where what we knew of. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to go into more detail.
I can a little bit. Yeah, I mean, we discussed, talking about all the things that Ann had mentioned before, a lot of program requirements and necessities that existed. And this is where we started as a project team with a set of 4 calendars that we thought might be needed, with their start and end dates kind of represented, so we could really drive initial, more detailed conversations so people could see something and feel like they were participating in anything that actually had more of a touch and a feel. Because otherwise there's so much abstract. We're talking about dates. You're saying, well, August 1st versus August 10th. We're just numbers at a certain point. So this is our visual representation starting point, coming out of, again, project team meetings that were then taken elsewhere for conversations. And kind of talking about that a little bit more, then, this type of content was then presented to many stakeholder groups. And Ann already talked a little bit about that. Sometimes that was a Findlay internal type of conversation. Sometimes it was a conversation that was facilitated by collaborative solutions, of course, the project team there as well, to do a lot of question and answer, to work through the details, the emotion, and all the different pieces that would come with making some choices around academic calendars. We developed some prototypes. So we took what you saw on that previous screen. We did actually build initial functional prototypes of those calendars, so we could see a little bit of a pros and cons to each of those, so we could kind of kick the tires a little bit, let Findlay see it, and actually see what that looks like, and how, actually, to the other point of the staff member who was very concerned about maintaining some of this, what it would take to maintain it, where the switches were, what the buttons were, if there was a new academic year being created, how did that function, what did it look like? Additionally, we then developed a white paper that highlighted a lot of those key considerations in the functional areas. I mentioned that calendars are a big deal. They touch everything in Workday Student. So our white paper went from functional area to functional area and said, what is the calendar going to do? Pros and cons of having one calendar versus multiple calendars for advising, for registration, for financial aid, for finance, for admissions and recruiting, to make sure, again, everybody was on the same page. And then collaborative heavily worked with leadership on talking points and considerations, and then we kind of worked together on what approach made sense to get us to a final decision so we can move forward. This is a hard one to roll back. Once you make a calendar decision in the middle of the project, you really don't want to be changing that. So This is where, we had to get to that point so we could say we are comfortable with this, that we're supporting this process so that everybody else could do the important work that they had ahead of them with the student implementation. So what that kind of looked like, as I mentioned, we had that previous screenshot of the actual calendars. I mentioned facilitating conversations, so there's some guy with a bow tie in this picture. I don't know who it is because it doesn't look like me when I look at myself in a picture. Anyway, regardless, what you'll see is that we actually threw that image up on a board. We had a lot of attendees for this session, and we started taking notes directly on the whiteboard about what could happen, what could not happen. You'll see that we started taking programs and crossing out calendars and rolling them up into the standard. We had expressed which calendars were really needed for specific academic areas. We highlighted, you'll see there's a little branch and it says clinical on that winter on the third row, where we went, oh man, our date actually has to start even sooner than we thought. And so we started kind of bringing that together, doing some tag teaming and discussions. And actually one of the things I really liked about this discussion is we also started talking about student impact. We realized that as we went down each of these calendar rows, that there was different, population impacts. So we started asking Findlay for enrollment numbers for some of these areas. So it turned out, the standard calendar was supporting 85% of the student population. And as you went down each of these rows, that number was getting smaller and smaller until I think OTE was maybe 0.5% of the student population. And you have to start then making those decisions on the amount of effort and the level of effort it's going to take to maintain that calendar versus the number of students we have in there. Is it maybe better to take that OTD sort of row that's at the bottom and roll it up and make it part of something else? And those are the types of talking points that we could provide that were, informed by data. They were not just sort of, gut instinct. We could see it in a tenant inside the system and know what it could or could not do. We could talk about how much effort, again, it takes to roll forward an academic year, whether it was worth it. And then let Findlay ultimately make that decision, because they are going to have to own this. Going forward, we're helping with the implementation, but this is really Findlay's calendar and calendar structure. And all of that ended up, we showed the 4. Actually, at one point, I think I was up to 6 or 7, and it quickly got to 4. And then we got to 2, which is where we actually ended up for our implementation. We have a standard calendar, and then we have a very specific health professions calendar associated with one major that needed that flexibility in calendaring to meet their requirements. And so Anne mentioned earlier that part of this process was even really understanding the framework it would take for a unit to convince Findlay that a calendar was still needed or required to move forward. So that is part of the approach for now, which is wonderful. That white paper I mentioned earlier, it does have the implications surrounding our implementation, but it also includes what happens if you make a change from a few calendars to many, or you want to collapse a calendar down into another, and what it takes to do that is really important for really everyone to understand not only what the implementation was, but where we are going. And I thought, from my perspective, this all went incredibly well. It was perfect in every way. There were no issues whatsoever. None. But having said that, Anne, what I would ask you from the collaborative solutions side is, do you feel like there were opportunities to maybe engage in some of this discussion in a different way? Are there things we could have done a little bit better and more effectively at all as we talk about academic calendars?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. Now that we've been through a workday, a HCM, a finance, and now 50% way through a student, we have that privilege of kind of looking back now. And I would say it's not collaborative that needs to be prepared or be ready. It was us. We needed to be prepared in a little bit different way. We needed to understand our processes before we sat down with collaborative. And I can't stress that enough, because while they can ask probing questions, with the context of workday, the student, the product, we still needed to answer those questions with the context of how the University of Findlay operated. And, looking back, we probably spent a lot of time with collaborative having those internal conversations, where in reality, we could have come prepared to the table with knowing how our academic calendars are aligned, knowing how our programs fit into the calendars, where the exact pain points were, how many students were being impacted by each of these programs. We could have come to the table being a little bit more prepared there. I think another thing that I look back on, and that concept of being prepared, we've had it since the academic calendars, we've had it multiple times, you know, institutional withdrawals, transfer credit evaluations, student self-registration. These are all things that, to me, we should have been prepared for before we sat down with collaborative. And when I say prepared for, understanding who the players are, understanding if there's a policy that surrounds it. And if there is a policy, you know, what committees would you need to take that policy to in order to make it change? Because a lot of times we're sitting in a meeting saying, well, who needs to be involved, you know? And so if I had to look back on, I probably would have, you know, maybe asked for a list of business processes and known who all those players were and the committees and the policies that were around those before we got started. Because we probably spent a lot of time, you know, trying to learn about ourselves in order to move forward. So, and during project time is probably not the proper time to do that. I think you also, you know, you need to know when to compromise, and you need to know where you can compromise. And to do that, you have to know the players that are involved. So, you know, as the director of finance, I also had the insight into, okay, if that causes billing to move from one place to another that a student's not used to, what does that mean? Because we all want Workday Student to be the end-all, be-all solution, and we probably went in with our own rose-colored glasses, but it's not. I mean, that's just the reality. No system is. It never will be. Because every institution's different. So you get to pick and choose the functionality that works for you. And you need to know when you can compromise and be willing to make that compromise. I think those are probably two biggest things that I would say.
Man, and I think we've seen some of that too, and our experience with Findlay and some of our other partners have taught us that there's some value in starting early, like really early before the project begins even. And with that in mind, we've started kind of putting together some readiness exercises and programming that collaborative can help guide some institutions on future projects, kind of just collecting thoughts, getting organized around data, governance, et cetera, that I think are super critical to the project, that are conversations that don't really need a design phase necessarily to kick off to have. You can start those discussions early and often. And if there's any interest amongst attendees, we have a data sheet that we're putting together that we'll be sharing with everyone that kind of talks about some of those opportunities with collaborative to work with us and you as an institution on really some of those readiness exercises and activities to support what could be a really successful student implementation, to kind of get your ducks in a row and hit the ground running once the project really gets going. So you know who needs to approve everything, you know where the data is coming from and how it needs to get where it needs to go, all really, really critical thing. Having said that, I think that's the end of, yeah.
Oh, that's probably another piece, Brian, that I would say that the University of Findlay, we learned during the project and should have not done. And actually we even talked, you know, after we got out of HCM and finance, we said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. And we did it. We didn't create our data library. So we didn't spend the time before the project started to understand where our data actually lives. You know, whether it's programs of study, primary programs of study, multiple conferral dates, student information, personal information, all those kind of things. I would really, really highly encourage any school to understand their own data, have their own data library, so that when collaborative comes in and says, I need here's your workbook, I need conferral date here, you know, for a degree, and maybe you have 2 degrees, you know, and so you need 2 conferral dates. And so really you have to understand your own data, because they can only speak to you from a Workday, you know, where that data is going to land in Workday. They can't tell you where it comes out of your system from. And so if you can build your own data library before you engage, that would be really helpful, I'm sure, for your IT folks. And then another piece I like to mention is you really have to understand how your project team works. So our project team at the University of Findlay is visual. They like to see things, they like to read things. They do not do well in abstract, so if you're talking in, well, let's imagine this, you just lost them. I mean, they're very technical people. And so, with the academic calendars, it was one of our first hurdles that really pointed it out to us. And really, it has set the stage for almost everything going forward, that we like to deliver, something for them to read, something for them to see, because they just don't do well in abstract. So those are probably two other things I would add.
Thank you, Anne. Stephanie, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for any additional questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. I think you've done a great job of really answering a couple of the questions that did come in, and specifically for you around just, is there something that you guys would have liked to know going into this, or maybe something that your team would recommend as they consider a student implementation? I think you did a great job of covering that. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that particular question? I mean, you can hit the nail on the head.
Academics is all around policies, so just know who owns them and where they live and what they say before you start building is probably one of the biggest takeaways.
That's great. And Brian, one question that came in, I think you can answer if you want to provide a little bit more detail. I know you touched on it briefly, but is there anything else you can tell us about the student readiness programs Collab offers?
Sure. So kind of as reference, we have some student readiness programming that we're putting together. And the thing I would point out is that we want to make this a useful exercise for any institution that we would work with. So we have a couple different approaches in mind. There's kind of one-day version versus a multi-week version. In-person is very challenging these days. So we also have a lot of online considerations and Zoom conferencing. Or Zoom, but any sort of GoToMeeting. We use GoToMeeting, so why did I say Zoom? Whatever. Anyway, but when we talk about different styles of offering and structuring, we have some key topics that we always like to make sure that we cover. Those big governance and data issues would be something that is always in there. But it's the type of readiness programming that what we would be looking for is some information even from you as a institution reaching out to us for this type of thing. Are there particular subjects or concerns that you feel like keep coming up and that you need some additional information about how Workday does it, or some best practices around pulling some information together? I think things like degree auditing comes up fairly regularly when I do some conversations. The academic calendars are almost always an item that is discussed. Are there financial aid concerns and compliance there with R2T4 or some other pain point? And our readiness package that we're kind of putting together, again, in different formats and structures, is meant to accommodate some of those big key things that we know that you probably need to start talking about and working on, but also give you some flexibility to ask some really important key questions, get the right people in the room to have some conversations about what might need to happen to position yourself to be successful with Workday Student. So I'm pretty excited that we get to do it. We've actually done versions of it a couple different times with our partners, and it's been very successful. I walked into a couple, I'm on the record side a little bit more, registrar staff who are really concerned about transcripting, transfer credit, that type of thing. And it was really nice to be able to talk to a functional team that wasn't ready for student yet. They hope to get there, but be able to work through that and talk about what Workday is and isn't, where they currently are. We learned a lot about the institution, which is actually wonderful. It's sort of a pre-design activity. We know a lot more for when the project starts. And I think they have a better frame of reference for where a project would go and what kinds of questions we'd ask once we really hit the ground running. So I'm excited about student readiness. From that perspective, like I said, I think it helps position some of those key things, but we've tried to design it around being really flexible and targeted to institutional needs.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Brian. I think those are all the questions we had messaged into us. If anybody has any questions that we may have missed, please feel free to reach out to us. And I'll take a peek before we shut down the webinar and see if anybody pings any other questions over. But thank you so much to Anne and Brian, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this valuable, and we look forward to having you join us again. We do have a part 2 coming soon. So again, I'll take a peek and see if we have any other questions. And we'll be sure to follow up with you as soon as we can. And again, this will be available for playback tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, really appreciate the time.
Thank you.